Welcome to the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScriptPodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Hey everyone, welcome back to OnScript. This is Matt Lynch coming to you from Regent College in Vancouver. We have back on the podcast Dr. Malka Simkovich, who is going to be talking about a new book that she has. So she's always a very engaging person to talk with, and I really appreciate what she has to say in this interview. Thanks to those of you who listen, who support the podcast, either by sharing the word or by donating. We really appreciate that. Any way you can get the word out is welcome. Without further ado, enjoy this episode. My guest today is Dr. Malka Simkovich, who is editor-in-chief at the Jewish Publication Society and visiting professor at Yeshiva University's Revel Graduate School for Jewish Studies. Before taking up the role at JPS, she was the Crown Ryan Chair of Jewish Studies at Catholic Theological Union from 2014 to 24. So she's just moved over to the Jewish Publication Society, something I want to hear about in a minute. She's the author of The Making of Jewish Universalism, From Exile to Alexandria, also Discovering Second Temple Literature, about which we interviewed her on a previous OnScript episode. So I encourage people to go back and listen to that. And her most recent book is Letters from Home, The Creation of Diaspora in Jewish Antiquity, which we're discussing today. So Malka, welcome back to OnScript.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you've just taken on this new role at the Jewish Publication Society. You're editor-in-chief there. So what does an editor-in-chief do? Is that like a military post? And what's happening at JPS these days?
Thank you for asking, Matt. It's great to be with you. I am learning as I go when it comes to the question of what an editor-in-chief does. Primarily, I would say that we all editors-in-chief in the world, put together a publishing program, look into the future, into the coming year and 5 years and 10 years, and think about what, in my case, what the world of Jewish letters needs. What are the books that don't exist right now that need to exist? And what are the big Jewish ideas that we are trying to get out into the world? JPS has an incredible backlist. It is the oldest cross-denominational Jewish press in the English-speaking world. And some of the greatest Jewish thinkers have published with JPS over the past 140 or so years. So we really have a legacy that we're very proud of. It's funny to say we, Matt, because I did, as you said, only join in September of 2024, but I really do feel that it's a we at this point, that I can take credit for all the past books that JPS has ever published. Primarily, my position is one of acquisitions, of reaching out to authors or potential authors and thinking with them about what great books need to exist, and helping them put together the manuscript that will become that book.
Awesome. And, I think my sort of first interactions with JPS were through the JPS Study Bible, which is fantastic. I don't remember when that was published, but it has great footnotes in it. And I always encourage students to check that out. And of course, also the commentary series that you've produced and are continuing to produce. So what's happening? Is there anything new in that realm?
Yes, the commentary series is really magisterial. Of course, the first 5 books, the Torah commentary is already out, but we're still putting out the prophets and the writings. Some of these books are 10 or 20-year-long projects, which builds anticipation. When they finally come out, the world will go crazy with delight. One of our most recent books is a commentary to the last section of Psalms, published by Adele Berlin, edited by Avigdor Shinan and Ben Sommer. And we have, at the very end of the year, Gary Rensburg's commentary to the first book of Samuel. And this will be an incredible commentary. We're very excited about that. And more to come, Matt.
That's awesome. Yeah, you mentioned like 10 to 20 year projects. It's one of those things where I think of all my friends who are in biblical scholarship where they say, I signed a contract with so-and-so, I have this book under contract to write. And then you get if you do that for a commentary, especially a big commentary series like the JPS series, you get the privilege of having people ask you for the next 10 to 20 years how it's going and when it's going to be done.
That's right. It's like when you're in college and everybody asks you, what are you doing afterwards? What's your plan? What are you majoring in?
Right.
But Gary actually did not take 10 years. He is a fast writer and a great scholar. And we are very proud of this forthcoming volume, as we are of all of the commentaries.
Yeah, and Samuel, that'll be really great. Well, yeah, that's exciting, and congrats again on that role. I think that's such a wonderful publisher, and you're going to take it in some really exciting directions. So I want to talk about your recent book, Letters from Home, The Creation of Diaspora in Jewish Antiquity, which is published by Eisenbrauns / Penn State University Press. In the intro to that, you talk about sort of trends in scholarship with regard to thinking about the diaspora. So you say that while an anti-diaspora bias once pervaded scholarship, there's been an overcorrection in your analysis to focus on literature almost exclusively produced by Judeans in the diaspora. So in what ways, could you just talk about that shift and where we're at how your book sits in relation to that pendulum swing?
Absolutely. I think that the bias that we find in late 19th century and early 20th century scholarship on Jewish history, the Jewish scriptures, the bias is contained in the name of the era itself. When we talk about the Second Temple era, we are imagining this great temple, the center of Jewish life in Jerusalem, that all Jews, or maybe we would call them Judahites at this early stage, all of these Yehudim in Hebrew would have access to, would make regular pilgrimages to, would bring sacrifices to. And this situates, maybe not wrongly, but we do need to problematize it a little bit. This situates Jerusalem as the central locus of Jewish life in the ancient world from 538 BCE, or let's say from 515 BCE, when the Second Temple is built, through 70 CE. Now, there was a sense at this time that it was the Judeans who returned from Babylonian exile at the end of the 6th century BCE and the 5th century BC. It was these Judeans who produced an authentic system of practices that would bridge the world of the ancient Israelites and Judahites with the world that was to come, the world of normative rabbinic Judaism. And this work was being done in the land of Israel, specifically in Jerusalem, specifically in the proximity to this great temple. Now, part of the reason why this assumption was made is because the set of documents that authors were working with at this time tended to derive from the land of Israel and similarly focus on the land of Israel. And when I'm talking about these texts, I'm not simply talking about late biblical, late texts. In other words, the end of what we call the Hebrew Bible. I'm not just talking about the Book of Chronicles. I'm also talking about the Apocrypha, books such as Tobit, which was written in the land of Israel at the end of the 3rd century BC, or the Book of Judith, which was written about 100 years later, also in the land of Israel, originally in Hebrew, or 1 Maccabees, also written in Hebrew at the end of the 2nd century BC, or maybe a little later. Scholars are reading these books of the Apocrypha, and they know correctly that these are incredibly popular books that were well circulated in the ancient world. And they're books that make an explicit claim about the centrality of the land of Israel in Jewish life, both within the land and beyond. And they assume that while they know Jews are living outside the land, that these Jews are practicing a kind of corrupted form of, we're not going to say Judaism at this early stage, but Jewish life, Jewish practices, and that the corruption comes from high levels of exposure to the outside world, Hellenistic life. Now, what changes in the mid-20th century is that the corpus of literature that scholars are studying vastly expands. And it expands with the publication of what we call today the pseudepigrapha. Now, the pseudepigrapha is a very highly problematic term. It's problematic because when you call a collection by a certain name, you're presuming some kind of internal cohesion and stability. And the pseudepigrapha has none of that. It's a kind of a catch-all category that is ever expanding. The texts of the pseudepigrapha range anywhere from the 4th century BC or even earlier to the 4th century CE or maybe even later. It's a massive category, but we can say, broadly speaking, most of the texts that are preserved in what scholars today call the pseudepigrapha were composed between the 2nd century BC and the 2nd century CE. I would say the majority of them were composed by Jews, although some of them might have been composed by early followers of Jesus. And as these texts are being published and studied and put under academic scrutiny, scholars are realizing that Jewish life outside the land of Israel might actually be, I don't want to say more observant or more authentic, but might represent a more, to be honest, a more knowledgeable kind of Jewish life than they had presumed. And also that these texts show high sensitivity to the relationship between Jews within and without the land of Israel. And this sensitivity is what I home in on in my book.
Mm. So is the idea then that to take one aspect of that, like you can't make a judgment about, let's say, the sort of Torah observance of a Jew based on whether they're in the land or living in Egypt or Syria or something like that?
That's absolutely correct. I have said this so many times, and so I apologize if I'm repeating myself to those of you who've already heard me say this, but just like in the year 2025, you can have at this very moment, I guarantee you that there is, a Jew on the beach in Tel Aviv having a shrimp cocktail, and also at the very same time, a Yiddish-speaking Jew in upstate New York who will not have access to the internet or will have very, very limited access to the internet in the outside world. So too, in the ancient world, it would be simplistic and frankly incorrect to say that you can make any kind of assessment about a Jew's level of observance or internal spiritual world at all based on where they live. We have Hellenized texts that were produced in the land of Israel. And the best example of that is what we call Greek Esther. It's produced in Jerusalem. It is an incredibly, on the face of it, an incredibly Hellenized text. And then you have documents like 2 Maccabees produced in Cyrene in modern day Libya, which presents a very rigid understanding of Jewish identity and seeks to establish firm boundaries outside or around Judaism, which is a word that the author actually invents, we think.
Okay. So just on that terminology, we'll get to other terminology later, but just I'm thinking of some of our listeners and also thinking about my students sometimes in how they use terms like ancient Israelites versus Jews versus Judaism. What's your kind of like rough and ready guide to best practices for use of those terms? So like if I have a student and they say Exodus talks about God bringing the Jews out of Egypt, I usually correct them in that, right? Or that Leviticus lays down practices for Judaism or something to that extent. What would you say?
So funny because I have the same exact experience every Friday night almost at the dinner table, at the Shabbat table when my kids come home and my husband and I ask our kids about the weekly Torah portion that they learn about, because every Saturday morning in synagogue, we read one portion of the Torah and we complete it on an annual cycle. So on Friday nights, we try to ask our kids what they learn. And this comes up all the time. We just celebrated Passover, of course. And our kids, especially our youngest, will very naturally talk about the Jews coming out of Egypt, and then I'll say, B'nai Israel, the Israelites, and everybody else rolls their eyes. Come on, of course. Israelites, Jews, and then I get very defensive and I say, there is a difference. So they have to, my other children have to tolerate their heretical mother because the story of the Jews leaving Egypt is totally anachronistic. When I talk to my students, I ask that they, obviously they're writing papers and assignments in English, and I ask that they speak of the Judahites in the context of the first temple, the Judeans in the context of the second temple, particularly in the Hellenistic era, so starting from the 3rd century BC. And then at some point, we have to ask the very controversial question of when do we start speaking of Jews? Now, I also say this is a very distracting semantic because in Hebrew, we're talking about Yehudim.
Yehudim, yeah.
We're talking about Yehudim in the First Temple era, Yehudim in the Babylonian exile of the 6th century BC, Yehudim in the Second Temple era. Judaios is the word for Judahite, Judean, Jew. We can't get stuck in the semantics of the minute differences between a Judahite and a Judean and a Jew. On the one hand, I want to have academic integrity and say, look, we're not going to speak about Jews in the First Temple era or earlier, because that does presume a certain kind of observance that we associate with the later community that is emerging and ultimately becomes, I would say, rabbinic Judaism. But to Yehudim, there is continuity, and to outsiders who live with them, whether it's Babylonians or Persians or Greeks or Romans, these are Yehudim. And the ambiguity that we find today in modern times is the same ambiguity that was bothering everyone in the ancient world. Whether it was the Yehudim themselves or their neighbors, the question is not a question that we just discovered in the 20th century. It's not something that smart biblical scholars just thought of and they said, you know what has never been asked before? What is a Jew? This is exactly the question in the ancient world. What does it mean to be a Yehudi? Is it someone who has residency in the land of Israel and kind of ethnogeographic connection to the land? Is it a second or third generation immigrant who doesn't live in the land anymore, but whose grandparents lived in the land? When do you stop being a Yehudi? And then after that, what are you? At what point do we transition from an ethnogeographic identity to what today we would call a religious identity? All of that is tucked into this word, Yehudi, Judaios.
Yeah, thanks for that, for highlighting the complexity of this. And so maybe the confusion that we have among students today, and I don't even know what I'm going to say for the rest of the interview, which term I should pick, but the fact that that's mirrored in the ancient world, there's some comfort in that, I guess.
I think so. At least it's humbling.
Yeah, for sure. So in your book, you spent a good bit of time talking about the subject of diaspora and the relationship between those who are living in Judea and Egyptian Jewish communities. And so how are these two communities defining themselves in relation to the other? Because that's really important for getting at this concept of the diaspora.
It is really important. And I think that when we start to talk about the dissonances, the tensions, the misunderstandings between Jews in the land of Israel and Jews who live elsewhere, we have to situate all of those dissonances into the broader context, which is the texts that I'm looking at are texts that express profound care for these other communities and a desire to overcome sectarianism. Now, I'm not talking about every single text. I'm talking about some. But there is this desire, I think, on both sides of what we would call this diasporic line for unity, for some kind of cohesion. There's a sense of kinship. There's a desire for relationship. So before we talk about all the misunderstandings, I think it's important to say that if you're to focus on a single fundamental commonality that Jews within and without the land of Israel share, it's that they desire relationship. And we can talk later about anxiety over sectarianism and what these Jews were afraid of and the fractured nature of their own societies, or maybe not so fractured nature of their own societies. But we see a desire for relationship in these texts. Now, like I think many modern people, a lot of these Jews define themselves according to outsiders, according to who was not in their own community. And when we look at Judean texts that are produced, especially in the 2nd and 1st century BCE, what we find is a desire for assurance that spiritual authority, or Jewish authority, let's say, derives from the land of Israel. There are at least some Judean texts that want to assert Judean exceptionalism, and they want to know that Jews outside the land of Israel are recognizing the centrality of the land of Israel in global Jewish life and the centrality of the Jerusalem temple in particular. I don't want to say this as a criticism or as a bad thing. I think that there is a really legitimate worry that there are Jews living all over the Hellenistic world who are no longer making the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and maybe are floating away a little bit from their connection with the temple. And there is a very legitimate worry about what that could lead to.
So I'd never thought about that, like, this literature could be functioning both for the internal Judean audience, inspiring people to recognize their connection to this broader Jewish diaspora, but then also rhetorically wanting to commend the centrality of the temple for those who live outside the land. So as you're looking at this subject, what's the literature that you're looking at to see these letters being written back and forth? And what are some of the rhetorical strategies that you see at play in them?
This is a great question. Two of the most important documents that I think help us understand the anxieties of Judean leadership in the late 2nd century BCE are letters that were appended to the book of 2 Maccabees. These are Judean letters written by Jerusalem authorities addressed specifically to Jews living in Egypt. And these are letters that ask the Jews of Egypt to observe the holiday that will become known as Hanukkah. It doesn't have a uniform name at the end of the 2nd century BCE. In one letter, it's called the Purification Festival. In another, it's called the Days of Tabernacles in Kislev, which is an unwieldy holiday title that I think we could agree didn't catch on for understandable purposes. But these letters are asking Jews not simply to observe this holiday, but to acknowledge that the victory over the Hasmoneans in 164 BCE was merely the culmination of a series of miracles that God had done for the Jews who protected the integrity of the Temple Mount. And so observing this holiday wasn't simply a recognition of that victory in particular, but as a recognition of the central role that the Temple Mount played in the long, long history of Jewish life in that region. And so to observe this holiday was to acknowledge the centrality of the land of Israel. And so here I think scholars are quite wrong to call these 2 letters Festa letters. They are much more than Festa letters. To use an anachronistic analogy, or maybe not anachronistic, but to use an interesting analogy, the emphasis on the observance of this holiday is the Trojan horse of the Judean writers who really want much more than that. They don't want just the observance of this holiday. They want these they want these Jews in Egypt, specifically in Alexandria, to cultivate a relationship with Jerusalem leaders and with Jews in the land of Israel that recognizes the centrality of the land. The kind of strategies which authorize the writers are strategies that I refer to as ventriloquy, and I have some other terms. Mis onabim is another term, but basically what these letters do is they reach into the past and look for precedent from older letters, from older documents, from older archives that similarly present the land of Israel as central and its leaders as authoritative. This kind of citation that pushes the argument back into the past is a kind of a we could call it mirroring. It's a kind of an enforcement of the author's point that creates I know I'm using a lot of mixed metaphors here, but that creates a kind of surround sound stereo system where the authors are much more than just their own voices. They're representing this long tradition of defending the integrity of the land of Israel. I put that into conversation with documents produced by Jews outside the land of Israel who, interestingly enough, use similar strategies to make the opposite argument. So rather than speaking in the voice of others, whether it's Jews in the ancient past or whether it's Jews across the diasporic line, to make the point that Judea is the central land for the Jewish people, these diaspora Jews are using these same strategies to argue that Jewish life outside the land of Israel makes a unique contribution to the Jews and to humanity. They're speaking in the voices of others. They're speaking in the voices of Jews across the diasporic line. They're speaking in the voices of Jews or Judahites or Israelites in the past. But they're arguing that the universal God has always had a plan that the Jews would spread out and remain spread out permanently to spread knowledge of the universal God.
Yeah, it's so fascinating that kind of discussion was at play in this time period, because I think for a lot of Christians who think about the sort of shifts you see from Old to New Testament, a lot of people will cast that in terms of, in the Old Testament you had Israel, God focused with the land of Israel, people of God, and cultivating that nation. In the New Testament, it goes out to the nations. And so you have contemporaneous Jews making a similar point about the significance of spreading out, and would you say being a witness, or how would you cast that, spreading the news of the universal God among the nations?
And these Jews outside the land of Israel especially are reading their biblical prophetic scriptures in very similar ways as later followers of Jesus. They're reading Jeremiah 30 to 31. They're reading Isaiah 56 to 66. They're reading Zechariah 14, right? These are their own scriptures. They haven't cast those texts out, and they're reading those scriptures, and they're saying our own tradition is imagining a time when God will spread the people out, and that's a good thing. And we have a particular mission that those Jews in the land of Israel cannot fulfill, which is to spread knowledge of God throughout the world and model what it means to embody certain values that put us into reflection of God. Now, I would never say that Jews in the land of Israel reject these scriptures. I would never, ever go that far. But certainly Jews outside the land of Israel who are defending the integrity of their choices, right, of their lives, are using these scriptures to say, we're not making any new ideas here. Yes, the Jerusalem temple is and always will be central to the Jewish people, and we feel connected to the temple. So many of these Jews are sending money to support the temple. We know that from a speech that Cicero gives. We know that from Roman sources. We know that from Jewish sources, that Jews outside the land of Israel are sending huge sums in the late Second Temple era to support the temple. They feel profoundly connected to the temple and to the land of Israel. But they also believe in the future of Jewish life outside the land of Israel, and they look to their own scriptures to enforce that view.
And do you think that, obviously that played an important role in laying foundations for Jewish survival past the destruction of the Jerusalem temple? Would you say that the perspective of diaspora Judaism, like, how would you cast its relationship to like the need to make pilgrimage to the land, or to have a physical relationship with the land of Israel? What were they saying on that front?
This is an interesting question because we don't know the precise numbers of how many Jews were making regular pilgrimage in the centuries, leading up to 70 CE. We don't know the percentage of how many Jews were going versus staying home. It was, for many Jews, a very difficult, long, and expensive trip. But we do know from Josephus that many, many Jews were making this pilgrimage. He talks about the Roman siege in 69 as being directly impacted by the fact that there were many pilgrims in the city that year for the Passover holiday. And we know from Roman roads that are not wide enough to accommodate a chariot, but that seem to be walking roads for itinerants, for pilgrims. We know that there were Jews who were regularly making the trip to Jerusalem. What I think is just as interesting is that these Jews are going back home. We don't have any evidence of a mass migration from what we call the diaspora to the land of Israel. And they could have done that. If they can make the trip, they could have packed up their camels with a few more clothes and a few more snacks, a few more, whatever you need, scrolls, and they could have settled. But they go back. We don't have evidence of a mass migration. So they're feeling this connection, but they're also believing in the legitimacy of their communities, which are elsewhere.
Before we shift gears to talk about the concept of diaspora, you mentioned in the book how for Jews in the land of Yehud and then eventually under the Greeks, that there was potentially some barriers to commending this place and its authority to Jews who were living in Egypt because of their political fate and plight under the Seleucids. So maybe talk about some of the historical context of Jews in Egypt and Jews in Judea, and what made it hard maybe to commend, like, hey, the temple has authority and the land of Israel has a certain authority.
This is a complex question, but it's a really important question. And it's also one that I think is very resonant for the American Jewish experience today, which is that there were hundreds of thousands of Jews who lived in Egypt in the 2nd and 1st century BCE and also in the 1st century CE. We don't know the exact numbers, but we know that it was very important for Hellenistic leaders, the leaders of the Ptolemaic kingdom, to have Jewish support, because Jews were not only numerous, many of them were also of means and influential. I hate to kind of present a picture that maybe overstates Jewish influence, because of course this is a double-edged sword. The Jews are being accused by their neighbors as having too much influence, too much money, too much access.
Can you imagine?
Never heard of such a bias. But then Jews also need that very access in order to advocate for themselves. And so there's a cycle where they're being accused of having too much power, and then they have to kind of use the avenues of access that they have to ask for special exceptions, whether it's to not attend festivals to the gods, whether, especially with that, but there are also other examples. They have to have special protections, and then they need to basically assert themselves in a way that produces a circular dynamic of perpetual resent. So that's the setting. But in the late 2nd century BCE, there's a series of internal civic strife in Hellenistic Egypt. There are a number of examples of Jews finding themselves caught in the middle, but one really interesting one is when Cleopatra III is in a war with her son Ptolemy IX Soter, and the Jews decide to support Cleopatra, but the majority of the population in Egypt supports her son. And essentially, what happens is that the Jews find themselves on the unpopular side of the conflict, The queen is supported by two high-ranking generals, and what do you know? They're Jewish. Their names are Chelkias and Ananias, or probably Chelkia and Hanania. This is what Josephus tells us. These are two sons of Onias. Onias is either the person who built a very famous Jewish temple in Egypt or the son of that Onias, Hebrew Chonya. In any case, this is a very powerful, prominent, well-known Jewish family, and Chelkia and Hanania are the generals of Cleopatra. And Cleopatra is trying to prevent Soter from annexing Judea into his kingdom. You can see this is all very complicated.
That would get awkward.
It's very awkward when Chelkia and Hanania have to say to Cleopatra, if you invade Judea to fight off your son, you are going to imperil your relationship with the Hasmonean king, who at the time was Alexander Jannaeus, and this will decimate your Jewish support base in Egypt. See how complicated this is?
That's very complicated.
Right. And the Jews are in a totally no-win situation, because if they advocate for their kin in Judea, they're going to be accused of not having their own neighbors' welfare in mind. And that is exactly what happens. Cleopatra assents to the advice of her Jewish generals. She ends up forming an alliance with Alexander Jannaeus. This prompts huge public fallout because local Egyptians and Greeks are very, very resentful of Jews in Egypt for whispering this advice into the ear of the queen. And so this is one of numerous examples where Jews in Egypt are prioritizing, or maybe I shouldn't say prioritizing, but definitely taking into very considerable thought the welfare of their kin in Judea. This is a tough situation to be in.
Yeah, it's really helpful that you're drawing out the way that, although having different perspectives on maybe the authority and the significance of living in the land of Israel, these communities are caring for one another. And I think there's sometimes a tendency in scholarship to highlight the conflictual nature of different communities and the literature they produce, because I don't know what it is, just a sort of conflict model of scholarship that plays out in all sorts of ways. I see it in biblical studies all the time. Levites and priests, and the kind of like warring factions that we envision. And here you have this literature of communities with different views, but yet also caring deeply about one another. I think that's really important. I want to shift to a speed round. And so these are, you don't have to give them any thought, and just off the cuff responses. So what is the most significant book in Second Temple Jewish studies in the last 50 years?
E.P. Sanders' Common Judaism.
Okay. What's your favorite movie?
Clueless.
Favorite novel?
James Michener, The Source.
Oh, James Michener's from almost my hometown, Doylestown,
Oh, really?
Pennsylvania. Do you know Doylestown?
Well, I'm from Philly, so actually I do.
Okay. So Michener Library was in Doylestown, where about 5 minutes from my house. Anyway, that's great. Most impactful teacher?
David Glazer, my music teacher at Stern College of Yeshiva University.
Okay. Wait, what was your music emphasis?
I studied music theory.
Okay.
And harmony composition. Yeah.
Right. And you mentioned at the afterword of your book, your grandfather, is it your grandfather that was a musician?
He wasn't. He was an aficionado. He was
Oh, right. He loved it.
Classical music. Yeah.
Yeah. Aaron, what was his surname?
Sabgir.
Okay. Sounds like an amazing person, by the way. So I encourage people to read the end of Malka's book, where she talks about her grandfather. Okay, your least favorite student you've just kidding. I won't ask that. Okay, here's a joke. This is just for your listening pleasure. All right. My partner screamed, "You haven't listened to a single word I've said, have you?" I was taken aback. What a weird way to start a conversation.
Huh.
All right. What's one thing in biblical studies, or let's say Second Temple Jewish studies, maybe the title itself would be your answer, that you think needs to die?
The focus on sectarianism. And with it, I'm not going to say too much about the Dead Sea Scrolls, but there's a lot more to this era than the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Okay. a shot fired across the bow. All right. How do you solve a problem like Maria?
I don't know. How do you catch a cloud and pin it down?
That's good. So you grew up in the Philly area?
I did.
Okay. So you've got, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 options here. I don't know what area you grew up in, but 93.3 WMMR, Q102, Eagle 106, or Star 104.5. Do they mean anything to you?
Yes, Q102 for sure.
So like the dance kind of music? That's what it was
look,
when I was in high school or junior high.
it was Justin Timberlake and it was Britney Spears.
Okay. All right.
And a little bit of Eminem.
All right. All right. Those are my speed round. Oh, I have one more joke. All right.
Okay.
My dad was bragging about his new hearing aid. State of the art, he said. It cost me a fortune. I asked, awesome. What type is it? He said, 230.
Okay, that's a good joke.
All right. All right. Back to the book itself.
Can I just break a rule by going back to something that you said before? Okay. So I just want to agree with what you said about the tendency to look for conflict and to look for binaries, Levites versus priests, ritual versus ethics, physical land versus the kingdom of heaven. And there is this assumption that all the ethical material in the Hebrew Bible was abandoned, forgotten, neglected by Jews in the 600 years of the Second Temple era, so that by the time you get to the first century, no one is thinking or even claiming those texts. They're not even viewing those texts as part of their own scriptural legacy. And so when Jesus and followers of Jesus are saying we have to foreground these texts, the Jews are like, sure, you could have them. We're reading Leviticus. All of that is totally untrue. There are, of course, court prophets in the First Temple era, and there are prophetic voices, I would say, in the early Second Temple era who are calling their own communities to take a close look at these texts. And the fact that Jews preserved these, what I would say are criticisms, right? Self-criticisms, not criticism from afar, but the fact that the Jews preserved these texts, I think, is an extraordinary act of courage, because the preservation of self-critical texts makes the Jewish people vulnerable to outside critics who say, you see, your own scriptures condemn you. And that vulnerability, the Jews pay a very heavy price for that. And I think that they know that they're going to pay a heavy price for that. But the message of these texts is so important that they're willing to make themselves vulnerable to outside criticism. So
no, we could have a whole episode on that. I think that's such a good and important point. So many misunderstandings are wrapped up with, well, the nature of this literature, and also you're highlighting what I often see as this kind of stark contrast made between law and prophets, that you had Jews in the first century obsessed with dead ritual, and then a kind of prophetic response to that cares about ethics and about people instead of practices. There are many, many unhelpful dichotomies there. And also the assumption that the prophets' notions of ethics are kind of snatched out of thin air and not rooted in the law itself. Whether the exact form we have in the Pentateuch or not, it's a separate discussion, but yeah.
Yeah, I remember coming across a scholarship of Joachim Jeremias. I'm not sure if I'm saying his name correctly, as a graduate student. And when he was describing the Pharisees as being so hypocritical and so kind of gleefully oppressive of the vulnerable members of their society, I remember thinking, who is he talking about? Because as a naive master's student who was 23, I genuinely didn't understand what he was talking. And I asked myself, what community? Who is he saying this about? The Pharisees? Really? He's talking about the Pharisees and the later rabbis? I was genuinely confused. But anyway.
Where does the word diaspora emerge? Like, under what conditions? How does this concept come about? And what does it mean?
The word diaspora as a noun appears for the first time in the Septuagint, in the Greek translation, or one of numerous Greek translations of the Hebrew scriptures. The Torah, the first 5 books, are translated into Greek under, so the tradition goes, under the auspices of Ptolemy II Philadelphus at the end of the 3rd century BCE. The question of who exactly produced this text is debated, but I do read the Septuagint as either being the product of Judean scholarship or the product of translators who have an intimate connection with Judea and with the Hebrew language, of course. These have to have been scholars who knew Hebrew very, very well, and therefore they had to have had some exposure to Judean society, Judean thinking. The Septuagint doesn't use the word diaspora until the very end of the book of Deuteronomy. It does not appear. And this already is striking because there are words for spreading out, for dispersion in Hebrew that you might find earlier in the Torah. But we get to this word in the context of the worst, I would say, or the most shocking prediction of suffering that is in the Torah. At the end of Leviticus, you also have a prediction of suffering. But at the end of Deuteronomy, Moses warns the Israelites, not the Jews, the Israelites, that should they abandon the covenantal terms, they will be expelled, literally thrown up by the land and expelled into parts unknown, into foreign territory, where they will be a source of embarrassment, shame, mockery, and essentially pointed at. The foreign nations will point at these Israelites and laugh at them and say, look at how your God has abandoned you. And in a verse that describes this spreading out of the Jews, this dispersion, this vulnerability, this experience of not being protected by a God, in this verse, when the Israelites are told that they will be a source of horror, of za'ava, to the foreign nations, we find the Septuagint translating this Hebrew word za'ava as diaspora. So there is an explicit link between the experience of horror and shame and the experience of dispersion that the translators of this Hebrew Torah want to drive home to those Jews who will be reading this version of their scriptures.
So in its inception, it has a negative charge to it, to say the least, right? And is that a fair representation then of how it continues to be used? Or is it that it gets picked up and quickly transforms into a more neutral term? Because in my mind, like this is a term I never really analyzed. There's the exile, which has a explicit sort of reference to being gone from the land, whereas diaspora just has, in my mind, a more neutral sense of just community throughout the world. So, yeah. So what happens to that term?
Okay, so that's a great question. So first of all, diaspora is a very rare term in Second Temple Jewish literature. It only appears, as far as I can tell, 15 times in the thousands of pages that survive from this era. But the second appearance of diaspora is right after the first appearance. It's in the same passage. Right after these predictions of divine abandonment, of suffering, of humiliation and shame, we find in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 4, a prediction of restoration, reconciliation. And we're told, even if your spread out ones, your nidachecha, are at the edge of the heavens, from there the Lord, your God, will gather you, and from there he will bring you back. And nidachecha is rendered by the translators, the Septuagint scholars, as diaspora. And already we're establishing something very interesting, I think, which is that diaspora is not used to translate a single word in the Hebrew scriptures. It's used to translate quite a wide variety of words. So in the first appearance, it's translating zava, horror, and now it's translating maybe what you would call a more neutral term, indachecha, your spread out ones. We do find the first appearance to be explicitly negative, but the diaspora, we're told in Deuteronomy 30, at least in the Septuagint version, is that the diaspora will come to an end. Now, the Septuagint writers are writing at a time when the diaspora has not come to an end. And they're writing for the community outside the land of Israel, this community of, again, hundreds of thousands of Greek-speaking Jews by the time you get to the 1st century BC. And we're not sure what the numbers are at the end of the 3rd century BC, but it's not a tiny community. And this community is being told, you should anticipate your own demise. You should be reading your scriptures and finding in those texts the anticipation of the essential, the elimination of Jewish life outside the land of Israel, or Israelite life outside the land of Israel. Now, you mentioned, Matt, that you thought the scriptural term for the exile is maybe more negative than diaspora, which is used, at least today, in a relatively neutral sense. But if you collect all the references to diaspora in the Septuagint and elsewhere in the Second Temple era, and you set them aside, the Hebrew term golah, which is the Bible's word for the Babylonian exile, what you find, I think, is that diaspora is much more negative for 2 reasons. One, the golah that Ezekiel talks about, that Jeremiah talks about, the golah is always meant to end. It is not open-ended. The golah supposedly was going to come to an end when all Yehudim return to the land and the temple is reestablished. Now, of course, this generates huge theological debates in the Second Temple era when the temple is rebuilt and not everyone has come back, and then everyone has to ask, is the golah over? But when you're reading the scriptures, you're reading about a contained experience that is meant to end. And even though scholars today will disagree with this, the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, depicts the golah as something that all Yehudim experience. Now, today we know that there were Yehudim who never left, that there was always a community that was in the land, fine. But the presentation of golah in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, is that it's meant to end, and it's something that brings the people together. It's an experience that they all go through, they all endure, and then they all have this opportunity to return and restore the great temple. Diaspora was always meant to splice the people in half. When it's invented in the late 3rd century BC, the reality is that there are people living in their ancestral homeland and people who aren't, and it's an open-ended reality. Everybody knows that unless Messiah comes today or tomorrow, this diaspora is not going to end, or at least it won't end with a kind of willful initiative in which every Jew picks up their bags and goes to their homeland on their own. And so diaspora splits the people in half, and it's ongoing. In that sense, it's very different from the golah, and I think it's actually more negative.
And you also mentioned that, if I'm remembering correctly, this term was not used of themselves by those who are in what I would call the diaspora. But by Jews living in the land, right?
Right. The majority of the passages that use the term diaspora, and possibly all of them, either derive from the land of Israel or are written by people with profoundly intimate connections with the land of Israel. And so we find diaspora in the letter that I referenced that's appended, the second of the 2 letters that's appended to 2 Maccabees, uses the term diaspora. We find, again, the word in passages that want to make a claim about Judean exceptionalism. So, we could debate. I could go through every single reference to diaspora, and I know that there will be scholars who say, well, what about this text? This text is not from the land of Israel. Maybe this text is also not from the land of Israel. There are some passages where we can't be sure about their origins. But what I know is that this is a rare word, and it is striking that we have so many documents that were produced outside the land of Israel that do not use the term. Josephus doesn't use it. Probably he didn't even really know of it. Philo doesn't know of it, I don't think, because he uses it twice, but one in a biblical citation and another one to talk about something completely different, neutral dispersion, has nothing to do with Jewish life outside the land of Israel. So if the great philosopher Philo of Alexandria doesn't know the term diaspora as it's used in the sources that I cite, and Josephus probably doesn't know it either, it doesn't appear in major works that were incredibly popular. I don't like to make an argument from silence, but I think it is very notable. The rarity, the scarcity of this term, I think needs to be taken into account.
Especially when it's in Deuteronomy. That like it's there for the picking if they want to use it, and they didn't pick up on it.
Right. So I should say it a little differently. Not that they didn't know it existed, but it wasn't part of their own lexicon. And we can discuss, were they making an intentional choice or not? But again, it's in the scriptures, like you said, there for the taking in the Septuagint.
So this term emerges, and when would you say that it enters more mainstream use? Is that more of a modern question?
It's a modern question. I looked into this a little bit and I wasn't able to get an answer. At what point does diaspora re-enter kind of the English theological lexicon? Obviously is modern. There is a wonderful scholar named Stéphane Dufoy who has researched this, a French scholar who has looked into the usage of diaspora in the ancient world and modern times. And so I would encourage listeners to look up his scholarship.
We're reaching the end of the interview here. I just want to ask about the Greek Esther, which I think is such a fascinating transformation of a book, because here you have the original Esther where it doesn't mention God. It doesn't, the land itself, the land of Israel, doesn't play. Is it even mentioned in the book?
Exile is mentioned, of course, because Mordecai is identified as someone.
Right. Okay. So yet this is now sent to the exiles as a letter from Judeans. What are they doing with it, and how are they transforming Esther into something else to then speak to those in exile? So it's almost like, lest you think this book commends you just staying put where you are, we want you to see things otherwise. So what happens to that book?
It's such a great question. Esther is a Rorschach test. Esther is a totally ambiguous text. Now you might say, well, is it really ambiguous? I mean, it has nothing. How could that be ambiguous? It has no God. It has no reference to ancestral laws, has no explicit reference to earlier scriptural texts. The biggest problem of Esther that everyone loves to forget is that the happy ending at the end of the book is intermarriage, which in the ancient world, Jews would or should have been uncomfortable with. At least the later rabbis would be uncomfortable with intermarriage. Nobody talks about that. But Esther doesn't seem to have an explicit religious message. But here's why I think it's even more problematic. You could, if you're a reader in the 2nd century BCE or a reader today, you could read the book of Esther and make you could make one of two completely opposite conclusions. You could read the book of Esther and you could say, this is a story about how dangerous life is for Jews outside the land of Israel. Look at the vulnerability. Look at Haman's Haman's description of the Jews. Look, there's this dispersed land and their practices are, a dispersed nation, and their practices are different and they're disloyal to the king. And look at how dangerous life is for these Jews outside the land of Israel. The message of this book clearly has to be that Jews belong in their ancestral home. Or you could read the book of Esther and reach a totally different conclusion. Look at the ways in which the Jews, despite their lack of proximity to Jerusalem, despite the fact that they've ceased observing their ancestral laws, despite their disconnection to their traditions, even these Jews enjoy the beneficence of their ancestral God. Even these Jews are protected by the God of their forefathers and foremothers. Even these Jews who are partying with the king and his courtiers and don't speak their ancestral tongue, even these Jews are protected. And so you could read Esther and genuinely have no idea what the message of the book is. And even today, I have friends who read the book in two opposite ways. Look at this warning tale that tells us what will happen to us if we don't live in Israel, or look at how God protects all Jews regardless of where they live. Now, Judean authorities living in Jerusalem or in proximity to it wanted to make some things clear to their kin in Egypt. The version of Esther that they produce in Greek is specifically for Jews living in Egypt and makes fascinating changes to the book. Changes that are, on the one hand, very Hellenistic in style, but are very traditional in content. And I think that the reason why they preserved or they supplemented the book with Hellenistic style miracles and speeches and dreams and soliloquies is because they thought that this would be very appealing to their kin in Egypt, who were accustomed to reading such things and watching plays. They were going to see the local entertainments with soliloquies and dragons and kind of interesting bells and whistles. But the content of these editions are, again, highly traditional. And so you can imagine a Judean scholar in Jerusalem thinking, how can I reach this community? How can I get them to read this text in Greek in a way that reminds them of their ancestral traditions, but also is highly appealing to them? And so that's how I read the Greek version of Esther, as maybe counterintuitively, as a Judean text, whereas Hebrew Esther may well have been a, quote, diasporan text.
Fascinating study. So much more on that in the book. We're out of time, but I just want to ask a kind of in closing, maybe an opening kind of question, and that is, what drew you to this study, and what would you say is at stake in this discussion about the creation of diaspora?
Those are two different questions. What drew me to this study is, I think, very personal and autobiographical, which is, as a Jew living in the supposed diaspora, I always bristled at the term. I always felt intuitively that there was something about it that didn't sit right with me, this notion that all of Jewish life outside the land of Israel encompasses some kind of homogeneous, monolithic, theologically meaningful set of ideas. It just didn't sit right with me. There are Jews right now. There are Jews in Argentina. There are very few Jews today in Egypt, just a handful. There are Jews, some in Southeast Asia. I have less in common with those Jews than most Jews in Israel. I have hundreds and hundreds of friends and relatives and colleagues in Israel. I have more in common with them than Jews in Southeast Asia, not because I don't want a relationship with those Jews in Southeast Asia, but I simply don't know who they are. In the ancient world, there were Jews in Egypt who felt a connection with Jews in Jerusalem, and maybe were more interested in those Jews in Jerusalem than Jews who lived in Greek islands or in what would become Rome and those areas of Europe that were maybe relatively undeveloped. Now, I felt, as I was working on my book, Discovering Second Temple Literature, I felt that there was more to be said about this dynamic. It wasn't simply a matter of overcorrecting an anti-diasporan bias, right? It wasn't just a matter of saying, we need to be paying attention to one side over another. What I wanted to do was say, what is the dynamic here? What are the misunderstandings? And yes, that is very personal. I think that especially now in a post-October 7th world, Jews are asking this question and reaching new answers. What do we owe each other? What are the presumptions that we make about each other that might be incorrect? How can we support each other and also assert our own legitimacy? These are very contemporary questions. I got so caught up in that, Matt, I forgot your second question.
I think you might have touched on it in this, but I was asking about what's at stake in this discussion, and you seem to have addressed that as well.
Yes. And this actually brings me back to something that I said earlier in our conversation regarding sectarianism. Today, and certainly in antiquity, Jews on both sides of what we would call the diasporic line were very worried about what would happen if the Jewish world fragmented, stopped feeling a need to connect, right? Gave up on one another, gave up on the relationship. What would happen if Jews stopped speaking to each other? Would new religious communities emerge? Today, of course, Jews have denominations, but nothing like the sectarian communities in the ancient world. And what's so important, I think, to keep in mind is that these sectarian groups in the 2nd century BCE and 1st century BCE were tiny percentages of the broader Jewish population. And I think it was very important for Jews, both in Jerusalem and in other centers of Jewish learning, like Alexandria, to make those connections with one another, assert their own legitimacy, of course, assert their own religious ideas. But the foundation was a desire for a relationship and a desire to overcome the risk of a permanent fracture. When we talk all the time about the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes, I think that we can lose sight of the broader picture, which is that most practicing Jews practice a unique calendar, the Sabbath, holidays. They practiced circumcision on their baby boys. They kept certain dietary laws. I think we discussed this in our earlier podcast conversation. But the desire for unity and the desire for cohesion, it's not the same thing as a desire for uniformity. And the point wasn't that everyone should be the same, but the point was that they should stay in a relationship.
Well, Malka, thank you so much for doing this interview and for your truly remarkable book, Letters from Home, The Creation of Diaspora in Jewish Antiquity. I encourage readers to check it out. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast again.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to On Script, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.